a thought of the Sphira. Today is 31 days of the counting of the Omer, which means we're closer to Shavuot. In just 2 days' time will be Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer. It celebrates the passing of or I should say, commemorates the passing of a great sage, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but he requested that his day of passing shouldn't be mourned, it should actually be celebrated. So we celebrate Lag BaOmer, which Lag stands for the 33 in Hebrew. It's the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer. He was the you would say the father in Judaism of the spiritual dimension of Torah. He wrote the Zohar, which our Tanya quotes the Zohar very, very often. It's one of the main books on Kabbalah. So Rabbi Shimon, especially on the last day of his life before he passed, he taught some of the greatest secrets of Torah. And therefore we celebrate this day with fire, which the Hebrew word for Zohar, which is the name of his book that he authored. The Zohar means brightness, shining, glow. And therefore we celebrate the day with fire, bonfires, barbecues. We celebrate in a way of Jewish unity. We'll be having a celebration right here at our New Chabad in our parking lot. We'll have individually packaged condiments. So you have your ketchup packet and your mustard packet that will come with your hot dog and burger and some salad. And if you're short enough, you may even make it on socially distanced to the bouncy house, which we'll hopefully have here as well. But today is the 31st day of the counting of the Omer. So I'll be just reciting the Omer count and the thought of the day on this book that we like to use, which is called The Counting of the Omer, the Spiritual Guide by Rabbi Simon Jacobson. And okay, it goes like this. Examine if your humility is compassionate. Because today's day of Tiferet of Hod is compassion within humility. So we have humility, but we're trying to see if we have compassion in our humility. That means as follows. Does my humility cause me to be self-contained and antisocial? Or does it express itself in empathy for others? Is my humility balanced and beautiful? Or is it awkward? It's interesting. In the Talmud, it talks about a person who's so humble that he bumps into things on the street because he's looking down. He's not even looking ahead of him. So is it an awkward type of humility, or is it a beautiful type of humility? Just as humility brings compassion, compassion can lead one to humility. If you lack humility, try acting compassionately, which can help bring you to humility. And therefore, the exercise of the day will conclude the Omer thought with this exercise. Express a humble feeling in an act of compassion. That's a lot to digest in one day. Okay, with that, we'll go to chapter 31. I'll be sharing the screen in just a moment, so you don't have to worry if you don't have the Tanya book in front of you. We like using this book called The Practical Tanya, and I'll be throwing that onto the screen in just a few moments. But just to recap or to summarize where we're holding, and we'll be on chapter 31 today. If you're looking in the book, it's going to be on page 348. If you don't have the book, do not fear. I'll be bringing it up. The title of the chapter is From Depression to Joy. It's a lengthy chapter, 6 parts it looks like. And after this chapter, we go into chapter 32, which stay tuned for that. It's all about love. Chapter 32 is the heart of the Tanya, and we'll get to there in a few weeks. First, we're concluding this section of Tanya that has been the troubleshooting method or mechanism, where we're feeling down, we're feeling depressed, we're feeling guilty, or we're feeling shame, we're feeling hypocritical, has been what we've been talking about. We're feeling as during our times of spiritual moments, let's say during prayer, we've had inappropriate thoughts, and we feel down, we feel ashamed because of those. So the Alter Rebbe in the previous few chapters has been walking us through troubleshooting and helping us deal with these different areas that need work, that are flawed. But the main theme was that we have to serve God with joy. And therefore, if all these things are weighing you down, you need to get over them. You need to work through them in order to be able to serve God with joy. But chapters 29 and 30 has been on the theme where sometimes we need an intervention. When we're feeling cold, we're feeling indifferent, apathetic, and careless over our service, over our relationships, over our relationship with God. You then need to break it down a little bit. As the Zohar quotes from what it hears from the heavenly yeshiva, that just like a log that can't catch fire because it's too thick, it occasionally, you need to take it out, break it up, and then it's smaller splinters, and then it's able to be um, it's able to catch fire. So if the body of a person is not catching the fire of the soul, it needs to be broken up. In Hebrew, we call it bitush. In English, we're saying when a person is too desensitized, we need to come up with an intervention, which is really holding our animal soul up against the wall and say, enough already. You're bogging me down. You're stopping me from being in a relationship. You're wasting my time. You are sick. You are disgusting. Stop it. You yell at it. You make an intervention. And you also go through your past and see what needs correction and why you're in the state of being that you are in. Chapter 30 continued along that theme, that if you're seeing someone, and don't judge another person, because it's the place where they are at. It's the business that they're involved in. And for all we know, them struggling in a smaller area, which for you seems easy. Let's say prayer. You pray every day. They barely pray, but their struggle in that area of prayer could be so much, require so much more effort than your little effort that doesn't really take any effort. So in fact, they're actually in a deeper service of God, not necessarily on the quantity that they're doing, because maybe they're doing less in practice, but the struggle, the quality of what they're doing is actually a lot more. So don't look down on them and don't judge them. In fact, you should judge them favorably and look inside of you and see areas that you need to struggle a little more, where you need to push yourself a little higher. But now, if you, chapter 31, it's continuing along this theme, and that actually, chapter 31 will conclude this idea where if you make this intervention, if you're going to be very hard on yourself, it actually could make you depressed. You look back on yourself and you say, I am a disgust. I am a disgrace. What am I doing? Who am I? So the theme of the chapter will be to actually dismantle this feeling of negativity with depression, or we're going to call it, we're going to come up with a different word in our theme for the day. So I'd just like to give a little summary of what chapter 31 will deal with, and just here's some thoughts that I put together. Even though you're being pretty harsh on yourself, you need to spend one session or two sessions contemplating these ideas of the state you're in and how you need to come out of it. You need to get better. So a big part that we're going to deal with is being depressed, which is a very dangerous thing, and that's not something we want, or being in a place of bitterness. A place of bitterness, even though it seems so similar to being sad or depressed, bitterness is different. And I just want to explain to you, we'll see the wording, we're going to go inside, but depression incapacitates you. It makes you just sit on your couch and not want to move. You can't move. Bitterness, the point of bitterness is actually to propel you forward. Bitterness is there to bring you to action. And bitterness is saying, I'm not okay in the attitude I have. I need to change. That's the point of bitterness. Whereas sadness just makes you feel dull and null and numb. Bitterness makes you want to change, propels you to spring forward. So how do you change yourself? It's through being in a place of bitterness. The expression that Tanya will give in this chapter is, in the forest, you take the wood that eventually is going to be used as a handle to chop down the next tree. So even though you chop a tree with a blade of metal, but in order for the blade of metal to chop, you need a handle of wood. So it's from the forest itself that you have the handle for the axe that's going to cut down the tree. So it's basically fight fire with fire. What that means for us is that to get out of your numbness, to get out of your feeling of coldness and apathy, sometimes it's going to be this feeling of bitterness that will act, which is the fire against the feeling that you have, that will propel you into action, propel you forward. I went on a walk with someone who's in our community. We're going to pray for him. His Hebrew name for prayer is Ziv ben Tzipora Tanya, who needs a speedy recovery, and he's going through treatment for cancer. And he's actually next week going down south to Stanford for a month, where they're doing stem cells on him. They graft. I don't know the entire process, but a few weeks ago they took some of his marrow, and they're putting it back in like in a stem cell way. So I don't know exactly the details and the wording. It's not my field. But the point of how I want to tie this in is that sometimes you have to go to the source and you change it from there. You fight the illness with, you go back to the source and you start from the source of it all. So what that means is you go to the source, which you're feeling down and cold for your behavior. So you go to that place of bitterness, and from that bitterness, it'll propel you forward. We'll see exactly in the chapter how that we deal with it, but you change it from the source. You go to the source of what it is, because everything in the source is actually holy. It's a beautiful idea. Even something that seems negative, it is negative. But in the source of it, it has to be holy. It comes out to us as seeming negative and wrong, but in the source of it, it has to be holy. So if you could take that source, go back to the source in a place before it came negative, while it's still holy, you could actually change it from there, like the bone marrow. So over here, we're trying to get to the source of it, which is a place of bitterness. And when you're in that place of bitterness or holy negativity, frustration over how you're acting, that leads you to action. So I'm going to take questions. I just want to almost explain the monologue that this chapter will be giving us. Here's a script of how your bitterness will propel you into action. You tell yourself that truly, without a doubt, I am distant from God. I'm feeling it's loathsome to see the distance and the disconnect between me and God Almighty. It's abominable. I'm disgusted by it. I'm disgusted by me, by how I've been behaving. But it's just me. It's not the real me. It's just the outer layer of me. The real me is a divine soul. It's clothed and it's padded with holiness. It's a precious and beautiful soul. It's just being stuck in an animal soul. And therefore it's being covered over by this husk, by this layer. And this is a travesty. This is outrage. And therefore I pity my soul. The further estranged my soul is from God, the more I pity it. I will make it my mission to free my soul, which is a princess out of God's palace that's now stuck in the mud. I want it to return to her home, to return to her palace. Let her get a taste of her home. The taste of her home is when you fulfill a mitzvah. It's nourishment for the soul. So all day when I do a mitzvah, it's feeding my soul a little taste of what it's like to be back home. Especially when I'm in prayer, it's a time when I'm nourishing my soul even more. And when you do that, out of a place of outrage, out of a place of disgust or a place of bitterness over the state of my estranged soul, it brings you to want to be closer. It brings you to the performance of a mitzvah that will then bring you in a closer relationship with God. So that's my little outline of the chapter. We'll be reading it, and it's a text-based class, so we'll be learning it inside. But let's see. So interesting, Yaakov, bitterness on its own is not good. But over here, where we're in a place of intervention that makes you feel, oh my gosh, it's disgusting what I've been doing. You're almost feeling appalled by your behavior. That itself will bring you to a place of action. So depression is a negative thing. Stay away from depression. Bitterness, if it's in a time that you designate, either if it's a minimal time a day, 5 minutes a day at the end of your day to think about what needs to be corrected, or a session that you make once a week towards the end of the week, not on Shabbos, because sadness, bitterness is forbidden on Shabbos. It has to be fully joyful. But if you do it on Thursday night, which is looking back at the past days of your week. And then maybe once a month before Rosh Chodesh, you think back on your month. And also at the end of the year, the month of Elul is a time of spiritual stock taking, a time of accountability, a time of taking in a spiritual accounting. I know we have tax season coming up, but on the spiritual calendar, it's in Elul. And during that time, you're also taking an account and you're looking over how you've been. And so it could put you in a place of bitterness. But the goal is actually to bring you to a place to propel you to a place of action. So there's an advantage in the bitterness. The bitterness itself doesn't have any good, but when you utilize the bitterness that comes as a result of this thinking to a place of action, then it's actually a positivity that comes out of it. So thank you, Ava. Wow, it's good to have you in our class. You're already answering for me. That bitterness, it can be good because it pushes you to change. So on its own, there's nothing good in bitterness. But if it's bringing you to a place of goodness, you bring back the bitterness. So you know what? The wording we're going to give in Tanya in this chapter, and it's great, we're going to see it inside, is bitterness is the place, if I'm not mistaken, of klipas noga. So Yaakov, I don't think you were part of our classes before we were on Zoom. So going back maybe 14, 15 months ago, we were learning, maybe even more, like 16, 17 months ago, in chapter 6 and 7, we were learning that there's two types of klipa. Klipa means the shell, the husk, that is blocking the kedusha, the holiness that's inside, the goodness, the precious jewel and gem inside. Klipa is the outer layer. But we said there's two types of klipa. There's a klipa that's irredeemable, that cannot be redeemed. That's like non-kosher foods or forbidden thoughts, forbidden marriages. Those things, there's no redeemable qualities in there. There's nothing good that could come out of it, and therefore God said it's forbidden. There's no point of going into them because you can't redeem it. But that's the three main klipas. That's forbidden. God says it's forbidden because there's nothing we can do there to redeem. But then everything else, which is almost everything in our life, from our food, kosher food we eat, to the time we have, to the phone we have, to the paper we have, everything around us, and the feelings around us, and the people around us, we have the opportunity to elevate to a higher place. So on its own, it's not holy. There's some holy things. I have tefillin right next to me. That's holy. A Torah right behind me. That's holy. On its own, it's holy the way it is. That's kedusha. But everything else is not holy. It can become holy, like the food we eat or the sleep we have. It's holy if we utilize it properly. If we go to sleep saying, I need to have energy so I could go to work tomorrow to bring in an income, and you don't have to always have this conscious mindset, but it's just, that's why you're being what you are. It's for a better place, it's for holiness, it's for God, it's for my relationships, it's for my family. You're redeeming the neutral, the in-between, which is everything, almost everything in life. So that's klipas noga, which means the translucent, I think is the word. The opaque, is opaque and translucent opposites? Right. So opaque means you could see through it, right?
No, the other way. Translucent, right. So, you can see through.
Awesome. So perfect. So then, so this is opaque, right? This cup. So this is like klipa that is blocking whatever's inside, and you can't see through it. So this doesn't shine. This doesn't have any redeeming qualities. That's like klipa. I don't have, but a clear plastic cup, let's say, that's translucent. You could see through it. So you could see the holiness, but it's just being blocked with the husk outside, but it's clear. You could get through it and elevate it. So bitterness is going to be this level of klipa that is actually translucent, which means it could be elevated if you utilize it properly. So it's not something that you want to have, but if you're going through it because of this intervention we've been talking about in chapters 29 and 30, then there's a redeemable quality that comes as a result. So Yaakov, it's not so clear yet, but as we learn it inside the chapter, you'll get a better idea. But I just wanted to give you kind of an outside summary so we know what to expect. What if the frustration takes you to a place of depression rather than bitterness? So that's such a good question, Maddie. And the litmus test, here's the beauty. The litmus test to know if you were successful in your session is if after the session, you're in a place of joy. If joy is the result, is the reaction, then you know you did it right. If joy is not the outcome, if it brings you to a place that you want to just hide under your covers, realizing who you are, then that was not the right session. So you need Tanya. Tanya will describe to us the method, and not really in chapter 31, although it's going to give us a general outline, but really we're going to first talk about, it's going to pause. It's going to talk to us in chapter 32 about loving ourselves and loving others. Then it's going to talk about the purpose of life and creation and why we're here in the mid 30s chapters. But then in the 40s, which I may have white hairs on my beard and less hair on my head by then, but in the 40 chapters, it's going to talk about the meditation we have that guides us. So that's going to be very important. So Maddie, whether you're in Texas or in California, we're going to stick around and we're going to be part of each other's lives. So we get around to those. But chapter 31 will describe that. But the litmus test is if joy is the result. If it leads to joy, then you know you had the right session of bitterness. That every now and then you have to look inside and you say, ugh, what have I been doing? My soul is so precious. How could I allow it to be so sunk into pettiness, and sunk into whatever? And therefore, that place of bitterness says, how far could I go? Propels you to want to get closer. Propels you to a mitzvah, to taste the soul, its precious nutrients. So then, when you finish your session, it brings you to a place of action, a place of joy, and say, "Wow, I'm getting closer to Hashem. I could be better." That's if bitterness leads to betterness, then you know you're in the right place. But how to make sure if you're not, if it's not there, then you need to have the guidance of a friend, a mentor, to help make sure that you're doing it in the right place, to speak it over with them. On Tuesday evenings, we give a class on Pirkei Avot. And last night, again, in last night's class, chapter 4, we were emphasizing the importance of making sure you have a good friend. The idea of someone that you could relay over your feelings and make sure that it's going to be guided with a mentor to make sure it's being guided in the right place. Stem cell transplant, they kill your own marrow with chemo and bring your white blood cell count to 0. Exactly. Then they reinfuse stem cells into you. Then they can be autologous, your own, or they can be someone else's stem cells. So Jeff, the person I was with last night, it's his own, and that's why he has to go down south and he can't leave. He's like, we've all been quarantined for a good chunk of a year, but he can't see anyone because he's going to have 0 immunity. His white cell blood count will be down to 0. But anyway, yeah. Bitterness and anger can be, thank you, Shira, can be redirected. You can redirect energy into something good. All week I've been trying to avoid bitterness. And so Yaakov, you're right, and you should avoid it. It's not something that you should be looking forward to have, but after going through chapters 29 and 30, it's a place where you're feeling it. And let's see chapter 31, and maybe we'll talk a little more together, Yaakov, because that's a good point. I don't want you to be bitter, so let's talk. Thank you. Bitterness leads to betterness. Okay, awesome. Yeah. Let's see it inside chapter 31. I'm going to just pull it up on the screen. And thank you for all the feedback and comments and teachings that's coming on the chat. And we're going to learn chapter 30. You may hear, there you go. You may just hear that for a moment. I'll be sharing the screen. Here we go. So we just concluded chapter 31. I hope everyone can see. And here we go, chapter 31. Sorry, we just concluded chapter 30. We're now in chapter 31, From Depression to Joy, section 1. So this is a text-based class. Of course, feel free to interject or to either unmute yourself and say something or chat something if you feel more comfortable. But we'll begin it inside. Section 1, dismantling negativity from within. In chapters 29 and 30, the Tanya taught us a series of humbling meditations aimed at solving the problem of Timtum Halev. I don't know if you remember, it was already from a few months ago, but in chapter 29, the opening lines was talking about these Hebrew words, Timtum Halev, which is spiritual insensitivity. And we were focused on trying to change that. This chapter continues along the same theme. We also will learn how to come out of the negative state of mind and use humbling thoughts to propel us to positive and to joyous state of mind, which is obviously the ideal, a place where we want to be. Okay. Now, even if you spend an hour or two or more delving into the above concepts in chapter 29 and 30 at great length, to achieve ego deflation. I love those words. You're trying to deflate your ego and to have a broken heart, which a broken heart is not a bad thing. We're not talking about someone breaking your heart. We're talking about feeling broken over your state that brings you to a place that's higher. And as a result, you get really depressed. It's not a cause for concern, so long as it passes quickly. See below section 2. So Yaakov, as long as it passes and you don't let it linger, then you know you're doing okay. But let's see it. Because although depression stems from klipas noiga and not from holy energy, see chapter 1, page 41, it can still be something positive, as we shall see. So these are the words of klipas noiga, which I'm translating as translucent or transparent klipa, which means a type of attitude, or over here, bitterness, that can be positive. Before explaining how depression can have a positive result, the Tanya first brings proof that it doesn't come from a holy energy. So let's prove that depression is not a holy thing. Since, in reference to holy energy, the verse states strength and gladness are in his place, talking about God. So we see that, strength and gladness. Gladness is joy. So gladness is in the service of God. And the divine presence will only rest where there is joy in observing a mitzvah. And the same is true with study of the law, which means it's a beautiful expression in the Hebrew, Ein shchira shayra ela mitech simcha. I'm just going to pause there for a second. I may have told you this before, but one of probably my favorite teacher was when I was in 4th grade. We had a very dedicated teacher, and he wanted to make sure that when we study, when he would teach us, we were in a happy place. So the Talmud says that there was a sage whose name was Rava, who before teaching his students to make sure that they were listening and to open their minds, he would first tell them a joke. In order to open their minds, they would laugh, and that would expand their minds, and then he would begin the lesson. It would always start with a joke. I had a teacher who he would tell us that I don't know how to tell jokes. That's what he would say. I don't know how to say good jokes. And therefore, every day he would start with giving us a little treat, a little candy that he had. We would get so excited, and then he would start teaching. And he would give us charity every day, and we would put it in the coin. And so our whole day began with a joyful beginning of getting a candy. We would start with a mitzvah of charity, and then we would go to prayer and to study Torah. But the idea is that in order to study, we need to be in a place of happiness, a place of joy. Even it's so beautiful, everything, when we're in a relationship, it needs to be joyful. If joy is lacking in the relationship, of course, you don't get divorced. You just need to work on it to get back to a place of joy. Because when you see things from a joyful mindset, everything is different. When you see things from a depressed or angry mindset, it's a whole different take on it. So you need to be in a place of joy, which is, again, the theme of these chapters of Tanya. So before explaining the advantage of being in a place of bitterness, we first need to understand that you need to be in a place of joy. But then we'll explain the positivity when a person is in a place of bitterness, that almost it comes and he's setting the time to make sure that it's safe and in a controlled environment. But usually joy is not only the ideal, joy is the only state that we could be in our service of God. And if you don't have it, it's something that you need to work on and speak to your rabbi to make sure that you come to a place of joy. Okay, we're in the middle of the Kindle. But if it's a depression over spiritual things, while it is still derived from Klipas Noiga, it comes from the good part of Klipas Noiga. Aha. So if you're feeling depressed over your spiritual standing, then there's a good part in there. So usually being depressed is not a good thing. But if it's coming from a heavenly purpose, meaning it's coming because of a spiritual, a religious aspect of your life that you're not happy with, that you're feeling ashamed, you're feeling stuck, you're feeling depressed over, then that's Klipas Noiga, which means that it's a place that can be redeemed that quality of depression can be utilized for the good. So let's see, I think this next paragraph is going to be an important one. The fundamental difference between holy energy and klipa energy is that klipa is obsessed with self, whereas holiness is willing to transcend self. So depression over spiritual things is a klipa energy, since it is focused on the shortcomings of self. But it's from the good part of klipa, since if handled properly, it can lead to a positive outcome. So klipa, in another expression, means self. It's worried about myself. That's what klipa is. It's self-absorbed. But depression over spiritual things is focused on the shortcomings of yourself. So that can propel you to a place of action. And bless you, Vivian. So gesund, as we say in Yiddish. And that is why Rabbi Yitzchak Luria lived in Tzfat. I've been to his grave, and I'm curious to know if anyone else has been to his grave in Israel. Has anyone gone to the holy cemetery in Tzfat? Ava, Ava's not here anymore. Steve, come on. Steve, you've never been to the Holy Land, right?
I've been to Tzfat, but I've not been to the grave.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Cheryl. So, and Adrian, have you been to Tzfat, to the cemetery in Tzfat? Okay, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'm getting a little sidetracked. But the Arizal, which literally means the lion of blessed memory, his name was actually Rabbi Isaac Luria, and he was one of the most instrumental teachers of Kabbalah. This entire book of Tanya starts in chapter 1 with the revolution of two souls, which is taken actually from Eitz Chaim. It's learned from the book called The Tree of Life, which was based on the teachings of the Arizal. So his name was Rabbi Isaac Luria. He died in 1572 in Tzfas. And he says like this: that is why Rabbi Yitzchak Luria of blessed memory taught that even, let me skip that brackets, that even worrying about your sins is inappropriate in most cases, except when you are formally confessing your sins to repent. But concern over your sins should be avoided during prayer and Torah study, which need to be carried out with joy, which comes from an exclusively holy energy. So just to explain this from the Arizal, there are times, I don't know if you remember seeing in Shol on Yom Kippur, a lot of us were not in Shol on Yom Kippur this past Yom Kippur, so it's been a year and a half. But there's a time on Yom Kippur when we actually beat lightly with our fist over our chest. So it's amazing because Jews, even when we finally make a fist and we're going to say we're going to stand up for ourselves, what we do is actually we just bang ourselves. But that's a time of confession. It's a private time, which means we don't go to a booth with a rabbi and recite our confessions. It's a personal time, but it's a time that's it's a time that you're going back and looking at the things that are flawed and need correction. So the Arizal says that that's the only time when a place of worrying about our sins or depression, it could be allowed, meaning you're reflecting over that. But when otherwise, when we're studying Torah and when we are praying, that feeling of worrying about our sins should not be in the equation, because we need to be in a place of joy to be able to serve, to pray, and to learn Torah to do it properly. So the Arizal says that joy is the only way. And I don't know if anyone has been, but in Israel, there's a lot of Breslev Hasidim. Breslev Hasidim emphasize joy to a very strong degree, which is beautiful, because that's how we're supposed to serve God. We're in a place of joy. So the Arizal says that other than during a specific time of confession, which is a very specific time, we shouldn't be even worrying about our sins. We shouldn't let it bog us down. So after understanding this idea that joy is the ideal, I'm just going to reshare the screen. So now, but in this chapter, we're saying that no, on the contrary, we should be utilizing our depression for a positive state. So even though joy is the usual state, but let's continue on the second paragraph from the top. If depression over your spiritual standings comes from klipa, how could it be a positive thing? It's klipa. So nevertheless, Despite this depression stemming from klipa, the way to subdue the sitra achra, which is the klipa side, the other side, is in fact through unleashing an identical or similar energy back on it. So it's similar to what we were saying before about the stem cells, where in this circumstance, you're going to fight fire with fire. So you're going to utilize the klipa, which is where depression is. It's coming from klipa, but utilize the holiness within it. It's a very careful a session that you have to have, because like Yaakov was saying, it should be avoided, and it's something that usually doesn't end up well. So over here, you're going to the source of it. Let's see further. As our sages of blessed memory said about Ovadia, Ovadia was a student of Elisha. Elisha was a great prophet who was a student of Elijah. So you had Elijah, Elisha, and a student of Elisha, his name was Ovadia. He was a prophet. And he was actually a convert from Edom, which was Rome. So let's just see that inside. As our sages of blessed memory said about Ovadia, I guess in English you would call him Obadiah, but I know him as Ovadia, who was an Edomite convert. Edom is the family of Esav. Esav was the twin brother of Yaakov. He was known as Edom because he was very red, and he had a red lentil soup that he drank when he was very hungry at the age of 15 that Yaakov made for him. So Edom means red. So his nation, which later is known as Rome, they're known as Edom. Rome in Hebrew is Edom. So he was an Edomite convert who predicted the downfall of Edom. From the forest itself comes the handle for the axe which chops down the forest. Just trying to understand this. Who predicted the downfall of Edom? Someone who came from Edom, a convert of Edom. So he was the one that prophesied about the downfall of Rome. So the sages say about Ovadia that it's from the forest itself that comes the handle for the axe that chops down the tree. Which means, in the case of Ovadia, an Edomite convert is the one that predicted the downfall of his native country. I'm sorry, I think I missed the page, by the way. Hold on, there we go. Sorry, I turned the page back. And similarly, we find in the Talmud, when a dangerous snake was killed by a dangerous person, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, who was the author, the compiler of the Mishnah, commented that the snake had met one of its own kind. So there was a dangerous snake, and there was a dangerous person that killed it. So he said, danger met danger, right? Its own kind took care of itself. So these two Talmudic sources indicate that sometimes a force is best destroyed by its own kind. The downfall of Edom was predicted by an Edomite convert, and a dangerous snake was killed by a dangerous person. So similar to that, sometimes the best way to get out of our negative state is by utilizing that place of bitterness, or in the English over here, it's actually translating it as depression, but utilizing fire with fire, which means if you go to the source of where the depression is coming from, which means I'm disappointed with my spiritual standing and my lack of of observance. If you go to the source of it, you redeem the qualities that's there, and you're going to elevate yourself to a higher place. You're going to bring about the downfall of that negative trait from that negativity itself, meaning you're going to utilize depression in a positive state. And really, the only person that could do that is you, which means when, God forbid, if there's addicts, a lot of times they need an intervention from outside of them to help them. But over here, the only person that could do this intervention is you. You need to have a conversation with yourself about how to overcome this. One of my favorite stories I love to share is, and some of you, maybe even most of you, probably heard it from me, but I just love the story anyway, so you're going to sit and listen again. In the early 70s, there was a young psychiatrist who was observant. He was actually also a rabbi who was not Chabad, and he lived in Maryland, in Baltimore, I think. And he was going through an early midlife crisis. He had a young family, and he was involved in his community. He was a psychiatrist, but he felt, what is all this? He had questions on faith, questions within his relationships, and he was very confidential about this. He didn't want everyone to know about it. So he called the Rebbe's office in Brooklyn, New York. And the Rebbe's secretary, who was Rabbi Groner of blessed memory, answered the phone. And he didn't want to say who he was because he wanted to remain confidential. But he says, I have a question I need to ask the Rebbe. Questions on faith, questions on life, questions on family. And I'm going through a very tough time and I need to speak to the Rebbe. And so Rabbi Groner was in the Rebbe's office and he was relaying the message back to the Rebbe. The Rebbe traditionally would not speak on the phone because for different reasons, but the Rebbe would relay messages over the phone to his assistants, to his secretaries. And Rabbi Groner is paraphrasing the words to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked, who's speaking? So the person on the phone, the Jew from Maryland, his name was Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb, but he didn't want to say his name. So he said, it's a Jew from Maryland. This was before caller ID. And he didn't want to give his name. And the Rabbi Groner tells the Rebbe it's a Jew from Maryland. And the Rebbe tells Rabbi Groner, tell him that if he's in Maryland, he should go speak to a Jew by the name of Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb. And the Jew hears this, and Rabbi Groner repeats it. And the Jew says, I'm Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb. That's who's speaking. And Rabbi Groner repeats that to the Rebbe, saying, this is Weinreb on the phone. To which the Rebbe responds that sometimes a person needs to have a conversation with themselves, which means Weinreb has to speak to Weinreb. It's a powerful story because Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb continues that it was for the first time in his life that he actually started thinking on his own, where even though he was a psychiatrist, he was always looking to mentors for advice and guidance. And over here, he started actually talking to himself. And he says it was the best advice. It guided him. It helped him whenever he needed advice. Before going to other people, he would talk to himself first and seeing what does Weinreb say about this. He became the vice president of the OU. I don't know if you ever saw the kosher symbols, the circle U, which stands for Orthodox Union, which is a very big organization in New York on the East Coast. And he became now he's the rabbi emeritus of the OU. And he wrote, he's older now, but he said that was a changing moment in his life when the Rebbe basically guided him to speak to yourself. So this intervention and working on ourselves could only happen within you, but it's you that's going to change it. And therefore, even if you're in a place of bitterness, over here is translating it as depression, realize that if you take the positive quality, the source of it, you could actually fight that klipa with the source of it, which is actually holy. So it's interesting. Tzfat, by the way, I'm just reading in the comments. That's how Shira. That's how I spell it, that's how I spell it. Also, I think in English they spell it Safed, like Safed. I don't know why, but okay, awesome. Let's go back. The rabbi gives candies to his kids before Shacharit. Awesome. Let's see it back inside. And you know what? Before I go inside, I just see a practical lesson. If you're looking in your book, it's on page 350. It's just a few lines. I'll read it out loud. It says like this: sometimes negativity needs to be met with negativity. A short bout of depressive thoughts can knock you out of a bad state. It's a very interesting method that needs to be careful. You need to be careful how you utilize it. But if it's used correctly, it could be very helpful. Okay, we are on the bottom line. And I think this is probably a note from the Rebbe asking, why did the Tanya, which is obviously so precise in its words, why is the Tanya actually giving two examples of cases when you fight fire with fire, you fight it with its own source. Over here, fight depression with depression. The examples that we gave in Tanya were from Ovadia, who was the Edomite convert, that predicted the downfall of Edom. And the Talmud says it's the forest itself that brings the handle for the axe. And the other example was the snake, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says that the danger met danger. Right? The snake was killed by its own kind. So the Rebbe asked, why did the Alter Rebbe have to give two examples? And let's see the answer. So why did the Tanya need to bring two sources? Because above we learned that the way to subdue the Sitra Achra is through unleashing an identical or similar energy back on it. The case of Ovadia represents a similar energy. It's not the axe's handle, but the blade that fells the tree. The handle provides support, a similar energy. The snake, on the other hand, met one of its own kind, a dangerous person, which is an identical energy. So this is just a beautiful note from the Rebbe explaining why the Alter Rebbe gave two examples, because when we were learning it, the Alter Rebbe says you have to unleash an identical or similar energy. So the example from Ovadia was a similar energy because it's not the metal itself that we're using, it's the handle that supports the metal to break the tree. So it's a similar energy. But the snake and the dangerous person are both dangerous. That's identical energy. And about this is what it said, in every sadness, there will be profit. The profit being that the joy that comes after the sadness, as we shall see. Section 2, depression and bitterness. In truth, however, the depression brought on by the meditations in chapters 29 and 30 needs to quickly do its job of dismantling the Sitra Achra and then pass. Otherwise, the experience will be counterproductive. You can't linger on it. It needs to be a session and then you move on. And like we were saying before with Maddie, the litmus test has to be, does it result into joy? The most positive outcome of a broken heart and bitter soul caused by distance from the light of God's face and being enmeshed with the Sitra Achra is not at all what we call atzvus depression in Hebrew. So now we're going to get specific on the terms. This idea of being brokenhearted because of our spiritual standing and our soul's distance from God is not atzvut. Atzvut is the Hebrew word for depression. And that's not what we're talking about here. A certain despondency is an inevitable consequence of internalizing the negative thoughts of chapters 29 and 30. So you feel despondent, you feel sad. But if these meditations are done sincerely and correctly, atzvus, depression, will be transmuted to a more productive form of negativity, which the Tanya will refer to as merirut, which means bitterness. So we have a few Hebrew words here, atzvut and merirut. Atzvut would mean depression. Merirut would mean bitterness. The goal is to make sure that it's a place of bitterness, which is more productive and propelling you to action, whereas depression will make you just want to cuddle up on your couch and eat a tub of ice cream. So we're trying to make sure that when you're feeling this place of sadness from chapter 29 and 30, from feeling, look at my spiritual standing, look at my relationship with God, it's in such a bad state. So you're brought to a place of despondency. You have to make sure that it's dealt with bitterness and not with depression. So let's see that. So again, the Hebrew is atzvut, which is depression, and merirut, which is bitterness. Since atzvut, which is depression, is not an emotion you want to harbor for too long. Like Yaakov was saying, he's trying to avoid going there. Since in that mode, your heart is desensitized like a stone, and it is a heart devoid of vitality. So that's not a place you want to be in. Rather, you should aim to transmute the atzvus immediately to merirus, which is bitterness and brokenheartedness, which on the contrary, energize the heart to be stirred and embittered. So I think, I don't know how to fully explain it, so we'll leave this commentary in the Tanya to do the job. The difference between these two words. Merirus, which is bitterness, is energizing, inducing an urge to rectify the past and improve the future. While characterized by grief and sorrow, it is ultimately constructive, since it leads to optimism and self-improvement. Atzvus, which is depression, on the other hand, is paralyzing. It's a destructive form of grief that leads to apathy and a numbing of feeling. Instead of stimulating growth, it results in despair and self-pity, fueling a vicious cycle of deterioration. That is why it must not be allowed to linger. So this explains it. I think they did a pretty good job explaining it, where merirus is bitterness, that's energizing. That's getting you to propel into action, to improve myself, it brings you to a place that's optimist, to know that I could be better. Atzvus is a place of paralysis, where it's making you numb and feeling despair. So you want to make sure you don't linger in a place of depression. You right away transmute it, I like that word, into bitterness. And that bitterness is the right place to be in. Rather, the reason why Merirus is constructive is because, unlike Atzvus, which depression, which stems from Klipa, Merirus is an energy from holy Gevuras, harshness. Holy Gevuras, harshness. So let's see this Kabbalah, and then I'll try to explain it, but this should be really nice. In holy energy, there is both chesed, which is generosity, and Gevura, which is harshness. If an energy is holy, but harsh, it will lead you to Merirus, a constructive and useful negativity. So just to explain this a little bit, and let's see, Yaakov, a fire in an oil field is put out with dynamite. Oh, interesting. Huh. Fire in an oil field. That's great. Awesome, Yaakov. Thank you. And also, I'm not sure, but like in science, like combustion of energy, if you put even more energy, I'm not sure exactly how it works, but there's a similar idea also with energy. But the point for here, it's just a really cool idea. In Kabbalah, in the Sephira, the emotions, the attributes of God, which reflect the emotions within us, there's a place of kindness, love. In Hebrew, it's called chesed. And there's also one of Gevura. Gevura is discipline or harshness, severity, and justice. Both are important. Gevura seems more harsh. It's more disciplinarian. It's more tough love, I would say. But if it's used correctly, it's actually very holy. So there's certain, actually, I don't know if I'm trying to see who was at our Seder, but our custom at our Seder, we have we have a middle matzah out of the 3 matzahs that we actually break into 2. Half the matzah, the bigger half, becomes the afikoman. Now, the Chabad custom is to take that afikoman matzah, that half a matzah, and to break it into 5 pieces. There's certain things we do that we do in layers of 5. Another one is, and I want to explain to you why 5. Another example is on the last day of Sukkot is actually called, I don't know, Maddie in Scotland, if you guys had this, but the last day of Sukkot before Simchas Torah, we have a day that's called Hoshaina Rabbah. And I don't know if anyone heard of it. We take willows, but instead of just the 2 willows that's on the lulav, we actually take a bundle of 5 willows. We bundle it together, and we do a special prayer. Willows grow by the water, so it's the fall season when we pray to God that we should have a rainy winter. But literally, Hashaina means deliver us. And we take these 5 willows, which usually the willows is it's a day of willows is a symbol of judgment. It's more of a place of, I don't know, sadness, but it's a place of harshness, like a willow tree. And what we're trying to do is sweeten the severity of judgment. So usually the last day of Sukkot is considered to be the continuation, the conclusion of the judgment of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So we're trying to sweeten the judgment. And what we do is we take a willow, which is a symbol of judgment, and we bang it on the ground 5 times. Maddie, did you do this with us? Have you ever?
It doesn't ring a bell, I have to say. And maybe more religious Jews did it in Scotland, like Chabad there.
Right.
I
So
definitely don't.
One year, I don't know if you remember, one year you came to our sukkah on that final day of Sukkot, and we danced with Sean. We had a good time. But,
yes.
but right before the dinner, it was right before sundown, we actually, whoever was there, maybe you came a little later, we took the branches and we banged them. Anyway, but my point is, like the matzah, we break into 5, and like the willow that we bang 5 times, there's 5 harsh judgments that need to be sweetened. But if it utilized correctly, in the source of the judgment is actually very holy, and you could sweeten it. So I'm just bringing that as a tradition and a custom that we do. But the point for our text of what we're learning is that in the source, if you get to the source of that depression, it could be holy. But you want to make sure it doesn't linger, because then it's going to come to a place that's not good. But in the source of it, in the gevura, the bitterness of it, which is the harsh part, that actually could be right away utilized for holiness, for productivity, and for action and as an advantageous state, which, like we said before, in every place of bitterness there can be advantage, which is, I think, a quote we just quoted from Proverbs. In every sadness there will be profit. Let's just wrap up this message. Let's see if we can finish off this section. We'll get to section 3. On top of the page. And joy is from the holy energy of chesed. For the heart contains both chesed, which is kindness, love, and gevura, which is harshness and justice, and both are pathways to God. One leads to love of God, one leads to reverence, respect, awe of God. So even though we usually steer away from gevura due to its severity, sometimes it's necessary to arouse the powers of holy gevura, to make judgment sweet. Usually we counteract negativity by being more positive. But if you reach a state of timtum alev, which is spiritual desensitization, it means that negative energy has managed to get a hold on you and trap you. So to break out of this jail, you need to confront the negativity head on by employing the counterforce of holy gevura, which is in the form of mirirus. Holy gevura works not by overpowering impure gevura, but by sweetening it. At its root, impure gevura is actually derived from the holy version. Only its connection has been lost, rendering the gevura impure and negative. But when holy gevura shines strongly into its pure offshoot, the energies are connected, and then the negative becomes positive and sweet again. Practically, that's what happens when you use mirirus to counteract your timtum alev and atzvut, which is depression. The holy gevura of mirirus shines into the klipa that brought about your timtum alev and sweetens it. If you don't have the book, I recommend actually to screenshot this section, because there's a lot of Kabbalah that's found here. The way you fight harshness is by sweetening it. The way we're saying here, the way you get out of a jail is by confronting the negativity head on and employing holy gevura. Holy gevura is this place that when you're feeling numb and timtum alev, spiritually desensitized, you're going to counteract it with the sweetening of the gevura, which is done through a place of bitterness that comes to a place of action. Yeah, there's definitely a lot that's going on there. Okay, I think we may stop here. We're getting to our time. I'll just end with a practical lesson. That's again on our page, this time on page 352. And it's a good way to end the class. If you feel you are in a state of atzvus, which is depression, try to transform the emotion into the more empowering and energizing form of mirirus, which is bitterness. You can do this by getting angry with your impulse to evil. Tell it what you really think of it. And we didn't get to that part of the section, but in the next week, we're going to say that sometimes you have to, what's the word? I guess we'll find it. Become angry on your impulse to evil. We'll get to that next week. But it's that idea of counteracting it with fire, facing it head on by utilizing that depression or sadness in a positive state. Okay, I think we hit our time, but it's there's definitely a lot to speak about here. I would say hold off on utilizing this and transmuting it to the good until we finish this section next week and understanding exactly when to do it, how to do it, with whom to do it. Okay, awesome. Don't forget, tomorrow evening, come to a barbecue. It's at 6 p.m. here at Chabad. You could reserve online, jewishnevada.com/lag. And we should have a party. We should have a great time.
Thanks, Rabbi.
You are
Thank
welcome.
you.
I'll be there
Have
in
a great rest
spirit.
of your week.
Thank you. I hope to see you
Bye.
tomorrow
Oh,
for the
good.
first
Thank you,
time.
Ron. Awesome. I'm
coming.
looking forward. Thank you. L'chaim. I'm looking
Bye.
forward. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.